Let's talk about some sneaky camo-cloaked snipers of the Space Marines with an overview of Eliminators in Codex Space Marines in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this unit review I thought we'd return to the Eliminator squad and talk about how things have changed for them since the Space Marine Codex came out. Since the last video I made on these guys, things have changed around quite a bit. They dropped in points cost quite a lot in one of the balance data slate updates. The new Codex has brought them more options, but along with that has also brought them some more competition, perhaps mainly in the nature of the new Space Marine Scout squad. In the video we'll talk over their models briefly, go over their 10th edition datasheet and the options that you can take for them, and then go through supporting options like special rules, characters and the Impulsor gimmick, and talk about precision attacks and their competition within Codex Space Marines. The models for the Eliminators I think are relatively well liked within the community. Sneaky Phobos infiltration snipers, generally deployed in the vanguard of the forces and tasked to hunt down enemy commanders or take down high value targets of opportunity with powerful las fusils. They are perhaps kind of interesting as being some of the vanguard space marines that can bring the most punch to the table. The rest of the Phobos foot troops tend to be hamstrung a bit by weapons that are only really any good against light infantry. The kit is £35, €45 or $60 from Games Workshop directly. I'd say that's pretty expensive for just 3 infantry models, and perhaps not enormously big ones at that. If you did want to pick up some of them on a budget though, then they were available in the previous Combat Patrol Space Marines, so you might see a few of them going on eBay, and they're also in that Vanguard Task Force box set with the Monopos, Infiltrators, and the Suppressors. On the kit you've got the option of equipping them either with bolt snipers or las fusils, plus the option to give the sergeant an instigator bolt carbine, as we'll get to. And just in general with Warhammer 40k miniatures, if you did want to get them for a little bit cheaper, then look to local gaming stores. Element Games has them at just under £30 in the UK, and Gap Games in Australia has them 21% off for 66 Australian dollars. Both of those are links down in the video description, and any purchases made through them do help to support the channel. Starting off with the squad's basic rules and stat lines, it's 75 points for a squad of 3 Eliminators. Fairly cheap as Space Marine units go, though fairly pricey per model. At 25 points for a standard 2 wound toughness for Space Marine profile, the durability is kind of so-so I'd say. They'll be harder to kill at range than melee, given that they've got the stealth keyword, so -1 to hit versus ranged attacks does help out a bit I suppose. Otherwise they're particularly notable as being one of the Space Marine units that's able to infiltrate, so you can start them forward on the board if it makes sense to, maybe holding a position on a forward objective, or even deployed high in a ruin for some lines of sight. That can be really quite a big deal, and particularly even just with screening out the enemy. At 75 points they're cheap enough to be at least somewhat sacrificial within the Space Marine army. And access to move, shoot, move can potentially have them in a relatively far forward position but remaining safe, maybe popping in and out of ruins. For war gear and damage for the Eliminators, in combat they get 3 attacks at strength 4 and just damage 1. They all get bolt pistols, but the main choice of the unit's loadout is either bolt sniper rifles or las fusils, generally the las fusils tending to be a little bit more threatening. The bolt sniper rifles have less impressive stat lines but get the precision keyword for taking down enemy characters. The snipers are 36-inch range, 1 shot each at hitting on a 3+, strength 5, AP 2 and damage 3. And if you can remain stationary with them, then they get better in multiple ways. The heavy keyword has them hitting on a 2+, and their special rule called Mark the Targets means that if they're stationary they get devastating wounds as well, really quite a big deal versus things like characters if you do luck out and roll a 6. For sniper firepower, their damage if they can be stationary is genuinely fairly impressive, around about 3 wounds dealt to Space Marine characters with a 4+ invulnerable save. So just with average rolling you could usually expect say around about 1 failed save against those kind of targets. A couple of squads of them could definitely have a good chance to even down fairly major characters like Space Marine captains, and a single squad might have something like a 50-50 chance to take down a more minor support character, maybe one that's a more guardsman equivalent profile or has a worse invulnerable save. Whether or not they could remain stationary is a bit more of a question though. In reality these guys often aren't just used as direct fire units just sitting and shooting, though I guess you could change how they're played a little bit depending on the opponent. If they're on the move, losing the devastating wounds and the heavy +1 to hit, both will definitely hamper that damage output. The other option for them is the las fusils, mid-strength and high damage weapons, 1 shot each at strength 9, AP 3 and damage D6. Again they have the heavy keyword for hitting on 2s if they're static and devastating wounds on 6s. I think for a 25-point model that's at least a fairly reasonably impressive damage profile, particularly when it's on a stealth unit with forward deploy. Fairly good against anything that's toughness 9 or less for the most part. Say on average, one squad will usually get 1 failed save against a Rhino tank, so around about 3 to 4 wounds there, or usually roughly around 1 failed save against a Terminator squad, having a pretty reasonable chance to remove 1 model. In general, they just tend to be flat better than the Bolt Sniper rifles against the vast majority of targets for raw damage. Some specific things they're quite close on damage output though, but then they are losing the advantage of precision, so they'd be competing against other sources of Space Marine fire support, Hellblasters, tanks and Eradicators and things. And in reality, I kind of feel like either choice of weapon is maybe almost a bit more of a nice to have. In some matchups it could be really big. A lot of the time though, shooting might be a bit opportunistic as they're doing infiltration and screening type things. Overall, for the choice of main gun, I could fairly happily take both of these. At the moment I'd be a bit more tempted by the las fusils than the Bolt Snipers overall, but I definitely do see some people running the Bolt Snipers. Having a little bit of anti-character threat in your army is kind of nice in the right matchups. Finally, the last option for the squad is the Instigator Bolt Carbine. This one is basically swapping out your main weapon on the sergeants to get a downgraded gun, but if you do take the damage hits then it gives your squad quite a powerful movement shenanigan, and at least for the majority of competitive lists people do tend to take this, so in reality you only get 2 of the Bolt Snipers or las fusils if you take this one up. The Instigator Bolt Carbine just gets you a single shot at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 2 now. The damage was nerfed when they translated them to the Codex, though it does have the precision keyword, so it could chip in to hurt characters with Bolt Snipers, but just isn't quite as scary. The special rule that it gives though really is quite a good one for a utility unit. After you've shot with a unit that contains an Instigator Bolt Carbine, then you get to immediately make another normal move. So potentially your Eliminators could be moving 12 inches a turn, firing at the midpoints. That could get them up the board or to the right places for doing objectives really quite easily. Or potentially if you're already where you want to be, maybe even safe in cover, you could potentially do a bit of jump shoot jump, say move out from behind safety of a big ruin, take some pot shots at whatever takes your fancy, and then use the Instigator Bolt Carbine to hide back to safety again. It seems that for competitive lists, most people are happy to take that damage cut, though I do see some people running just squads of 3 damage dealers, as that makes the sit and shoot variety a little bit more viable if it makes more sense for your given matchup. Overall for war gear, I'd probably be most tempted by this gun plus 2 of the las fusils, though I feel like Games Workshop has done fairly well to balance the war gear's utility overall. There are arguments that you could make for literally every combination of loadout. For supporting rules for the unit, I'd say that the Eliminators maybe aren't such a crucial one to pile loads of resources into. Both at the moment could help out a little bit. With long range guns it's possible that they could just get a few more pot shots on the Oath targets and make them a bit more efficient with firepower. And for generic stratagems, Armour of Contempt could potentially give a small squad a chance to live when otherwise they might have died quite easily. If they can live on an objective it could be big. And the grenade stratagem for 1 CP is quite a nice one for close range skirmishing units. They could have a surprise burst of damage, and maybe between that and some las fusil shots or something, they could overcome a unit that usually they'd just not be able to. For the most part, I'd say that other support though is just generally a little bit less relevant from them than most. For the most part, transports just usually aren't worth it as they give up the infiltration advantage, and I probably wouldn't be going out of my way to either buy them characters in or to dedicate too many command points their way besides situationally, as in general you're going to get better value on bigger scarier units than a 3-man squad of snipers or las fusil people. Perhaps the one exception to the rule for the transport case though is the gimmick that you can do with impulsors if you really want to. This one is maybe a slightly cheesy way of running the Eliminator squad that I must admit feels a bit more like rules loophole abuse as opposed to something that was truly intended for the unit, as there's just not really any reason that jumping in and out of a vehicle should really allow the unit to fire twice. I was kind of surprised when the Space Marine Codex came round and they didn't patch this out. It's definitely not impossible that it could go away in the future though, either by Games Workshop doing an FAQ for the Space Marine Codex, or maybe whenever the next balance pass and FAQs for the game get rewritten. In any case, if you really want to though, you can create an Impulsor Sniper boss with a couple of units of Eliminators popping in and out of it and double firing. To do that you take 1 Impulsor for 80 points, 2 squads of Eliminators for 150 points, you can take either of their guns and one of them has to be an instigator in each unit. Then in any given turn you can disembark the Eliminators, you can either move the Impulsor before or after, shoot with their damage output of 4 las fusils and 2 instigator carbines, then use the reactive move from the instigator to re-embark on the impulsor, and then after that go on to declare firing with the impulsor itself, which now it has a cargo full of eliminators inside it, it can use the firing deck to make use of the guns of the units embarked and basically get a second round worth of shooting. To me, this quite clearly feels like a rules loophole that isn't really intended, and to be honest, despite the weirdness and getting twice the shooting out of the unit are still not rated as excessively strong for 230 points worth of Space Marines. You add up to 8 las fusel shots, 2 instigator bolt carbines, and a missile and a few auxiliary shots out of the Impulsor. It's definitely not bad, but maybe not particularly different to what you might have got out of, say, a Repulsor Executioner, and those sort of things tend to be a bit harder to kill than these fairly fragile snipers and a fairly basic transport. I think it's fun if you're going to be using it in the right environment. I'd probably be tempted not to use it in casual games unless you're playing with a crowd that plays things very rules as written, and I'd say it's likely worth double checking it with a tournament organiser as well if you are thinking about taking it to an event, just to make sure there's no surprises. Otherwise, for support options, the Eliminators do have a couple of characters that can potentially join them. Again, I would say that usually for 75 point units, characters attached to them aren't usually going to be all that worth it, but in reality I feel like the Phobos Captain and Phobos Librarian could be used if you wanted to, but maybe feel like they're quite niche choices. Out of the two, the Phobos Librarian maybe feels like a stronger option. This guy gives lone operative to the unit so they can't be shot at greater than 12-inch range, and provides a little bit of slightly closer range damage with a smite attack as well, plus a tiny bit of close combat. For 145 points, that basically gets you a 4-model unit that's not really all that good in terms of damage output whatsoever, but really quite an interesting utility choice. It can't be shot at long range, so you could use it to hold a home field objective, and with move shoot move from an instigator you could get it moving really quite quickly across the board, 12-inch worth of movement, maybe getting towards places that can do secondary objectives, or holding primary objectives that are fairly far flung and the opponent might not be able to reach. In general though, people tend to be a bit more tempted to take the Phobos Librarian on Infiltrators instead with their deep strike denial, though being able to access move shoot move is kind of big. Otherwise, the Phobos Captain at 80 points I think will be okay to stick in a unit of Eliminators. He provides the squad a free battle tactics stratagem each turn, which I guess could add up to maybe re-rolling a wound roll with a las fusel or something, though I feel like the main draw to bring him is the redeployment option for Phobos units on the board, which could be kind of powerful to draw back a bunch of Phobos units that have deployed aggressively, say if the opponent gets first turn. He chips in a little bit of sniper damage with his own instigator carbine, and maybe an Eliminator squad could be an okay home for him, given that they're a bit more threatening than most of the rest of the Phobos, and he could keep the unit a bit more safe as well with the instigator move shoot move, maybe popping around somewhere near a home objective in your own deployment zone. In reality, I'd say that both of these are kind of niche uses. The Phobos Captain's okay if you've got a whole bunch of Phobos units in the army perhaps. They're both just going to make an excessively expensive unit for how tough they are. I feel like they might eat into the budget for utility units in your army, taking some points away from the mainline damage dealers. Finally, for buffs and synergies, the Eliminators can get a bunch of things from the new Codex detachments. Maybe one of the more interesting places for them is the Vanguard Spearhead detachment with its advantages for Phobos units. Plus, as well as the stealth that they already get, they can also get some cover at range as well, so are just even harder to kill than normal, even out of terrain. They've got a bunch of stratagems which I feel like are perhaps a bit more useful than the average ones for the Eliminators. You can get a +1 to hit and an extra AP, which could be big if they had to move and they had a critical target to snipe or something. There's a 1 command point that allows 2 units to return to strategic reserve. That's fairly nice when it's more efficient applying to 2 units rather than 1. And I feel like the one for a 6-inch move to run away from an oncoming enemy charge is a really big thing for them. In the right situation, that's going to lead to an Eliminator squad just completely living when otherwise they would have just straight up died by an enemy being able to charge them. And I'd say that that's well worth it for a CP, more so than most damage and defensive buffs would be. Otherwise, the others definitely have a lot of good stuff themselves as well. Iron Storm is quite nice just for single rerolls on a cheap unit with some fairly meaningful shots. A wound roll on a las fusel could be nice. The Anvil Siege Force could make them genuinely quite interesting units to just sit and shoot with, perhaps more than elsewhere, given that they get +1 to wound. It means that you could have bolt sniper rifles wounding things like Space Marine captains on a 2+, or las fusils wounding land raiders and things on a 4. The Gladius Task Force and Firestorm Assault Force are both kind of interesting for advance and shoot type options. That could make them even speedier across the board with their move shoot move shenanigans. And the Firestorm Force could help out their firepower as well. If they do wind up shooting at close range, then +1 strength is okay, and the +1 to wound from Crucible of Battle again could be interesting on the right targets. Say if they had the opportunity to snipe a character on 3 wounds left, and success would be absolutely game changing. Finally, there's the Death Watch and the Black Spear Strike Force. That one allows them to get sustained hits and lethal hits for a couple of turns, boosting their damage output. They like the term of Ectoclades, and you can take some in the Spectre's kill team as well. Broadly speaking, I'd say the majority of those successor chapters do have a few interesting bits for them, maybe the Dark Angels more than most with their stratagems, but perhaps don't tend to be quite as standout. Otherwise, for the unit's role, I guess you could make the debate as to whether or not precision attacks actually really matter for them that much. In the majority of competitive lists that I've seen, I generally seem to see more people using the las fusils these days, but maybe not by loads, maybe something like 2/3 las fusils, 1/3 bolt snipers. Against the right list, it could be very intimidating to be able to have the option to snipe some unique support characters, but there's just a fair few armies that just don't really care all that much about that, or have their characters sufficiently tough that the Eliminators aren't really all that much of a real threat to them. Maybe armies like Adeptus Custodes or Terminator characters where they're needing to wound on a 4+, or maybe worse. For their current points and utility, they feel like a nice to have, but not essential. If you compare their damage output to the Vindicator, then the Eliminators do generally tend to do more sniper damage than he will on average, at least for a unit of 3 of them stat stationary with devastating wounds. The Vindicator does have the advantage of his shield break around though, which could be quite big early in the game, definitely an unreliable chance to just one-shot an enemy character, but if it does come off and you manage to make your hit and wound roll, that one-shot definitely has a respectable chance of one-shotting a support character. With that in mind, I'd probably rank the Eliminators and the Vindicator as roughly even if you did want to add some sniper goodness to your force. The Vindicator's got lone operative advantages as well, which means he might get a few more rounds of shooting. In reality though, I think that the biggest competition for the Eliminators in Codex Space Marines is what's going to be filling the infiltrate type role in the army, which I feel like is something that almost all competitive lists do generally tend to take at least something in. As Space Marines just have a lot of very good units that can start in the midfield, start on primary objectives, or be in the right position to do secondaries and things. I'd say that for just about any competitive list, it's probably a good idea to have at least one or two of these units, and plenty take far more. The main options are the nice cheap Scout Squad at 55 points, the Infiltrators with their 12-inch deep strike denial at 100 points, the Eliminators with their fun damage output and move shoot move options, and perhaps you might include the Combi Weapon Lieutenant in there as well, marking midfield objectives for more Space Marine damage, and also being kind of hard to catch up with lone operative and reactive moves. Between all that, the Eliminators do have some stiff competition for units that are going to start in the mid-board and maybe screen out the enemy and do unit trading things on central objectives. Perhaps the biggest competition out of them are the Scout Squads, which are really quite nice at 55 points and having far more durability per point there, plus a bit more objective control, and their damage output isn't really even too bad either, given that they get a missile launcher if they want one, plus a fair amount of small arms and some attacks in melee. Being only 55 points means they're a bit more expendable as well, and their return to reserves rule is really quite nice for jumping around and doing secondary objectives if it makes sense. The Infiltrators mainly bring their deep strike denial to the table, which is just excellent to have parked on an objective, otherwise their damage output is kind of bad, particularly compared with the Eliminators, and their defense is sort of so-so, getting the 6+ feel no pain from the Gauntlet and 5 models in power armor. For the actual squad options, I thought it would just be interesting to take a look at what some of the top lists around are using. And just for a bit of interest, I took a look at 8 tournament lists that have placed well since the Codex came out, winning 4 out of 5 games or better at a grand tournament. All of them used at least something that had the Infiltrators keyword, and it seems that Scouts really seem to be the order of the day at the moment. They were used in 7 different army lists, regular Infiltrators in 4 of them, and Eliminators currently used only in 1. That list took the Instigator Bolt Carbine with 2 las fusils. It would imply that maybe the Scouts on the competitive scene are perhaps slightly stealing the Eliminators' lunch money. Despite being really quite a good unit in my opinion, they are being overshadowed by the other options on the competitive scene. Overall at the moment I still rate Eliminators as a very usable unit in Codex Space Marines however. Both of the weapon types I'd say seem okay but not super standout. In general, I think that you'd be looking to get both value out of their forward deployment shenanigans and double move options, and then just treat the damage output that they can do as a nice secondary, chipping away at some vital targets in the enemy that they might get unusual lines of sight to. If you do take the Bolt Snipers, they can be at least a somewhat scary threat to characters. They might force the opponents to move round or reposition, though you would be quite lucky for any one squad of them just to take out a character that had more than 3 wounds. I also do quite like the way that you could genuinely play them very differently against different foes depending on how important their damage output is, maybe having them just sit and shoot, or take up residence in a ruin and be pinging in and out of cover to take pot shots while not taking any casualties, or use them quite aggressively and screen or move block and things if that makes more sense. Overall, I'd say they're okay, but not enormously standout for current Marines given the options of Scouts and Infiltrators and the Combi Weapon Lieutenant. I really think that you're not going to be losing too much value if you do take these over them. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Space Marine Phobos Snipers down in the comments below. Look forward to hearing your take on the Eliminators squad. How have they been performing for you since the Codex, and have they been making the cut versus the other options? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.